This video is sponsored by Keeps. More on them later. I don't know about you, but I hate pressing buttons. Such a depressing experience. Why would you ever control a video game by pushing buttons down when motion controls open up so many exciting windows? You never have to learn anything, you can just shake a controller like it owes you money or turn your entire body into the controller, and suddenly every man, woman and child will be tripping over themselves to play your video games. This future never happened, because while some games squeeze motion controls for all their worth and show how impressive this unique control scheme can be for video games, so many others are merely following a trend that history has not been kind to at all. We live in a future where most of the big developers have let go of motion controls after years of vitriolic feedback from fans that this isn't where video games need to go. Often it pays more to work on every other aspect of a video game ahead of the weird way you make things happen on screen. Just wish more developers knew that before wasting everyone's time. Some of the design decisions behind the games in this video are baffling, to the extent that you may want to tear your hair out in frustration. Or maybe you're just like 2 out of 3 guys who may experience some form of male pattern baldness before they're 35. In which case, it's very fortunate that this video is sponsored by Keeps and their FDA approved treatment for hair loss. I'm not sure how well it works if you tear it out yourself though. You might remember a few months back when I shaved off all my hair for a joke that was definitely worth the hassle and weeks of my girlfriend calling me Baldylocks, but now it has grown back. You can definitely see signs of my ever-receding hairline that I get from my dad, pictured here from just the other day. That's why Keeps is so appealing to me, because not only are there numerous examples of highly successful cases, but they're priced significantly cheaper than their competitors, so Keeps won't rake you over the coals for hair treatment. The best way to prevent hair loss is to do something about it while you still have hair left, and Keeps' treatment package can take up to 4 to 6 months or more to see results, so it's important to act fast. The sooner you start using Keeps, the more hair you'll save. For a limited time, you can go to keeps.com/rabbid or click the link in this video's description to receive 50% off your first order. That's keeps.com/rabbid for 50% off your first order. Stop hair loss before it's too late. Right, let's wave our hands like we just don't care. Is it okay to enjoy a game in spite of bad motion controls? I know, it's completely counter to what this video is about, and you'd imagine that there's easily 10 games I can talk about with motion controls so bad that my piss boils just thinking about them, but I'd be lying if I thought that Wii Music was as good as it could have been. It's a simple enough idea that follows the Wii's design philosophy of making a pastime accessible for the unwashed masses, but much like Wii Sports, the complicated intricacies of playing tennis and playing the piano are boiled down to waving your hands around like a lunatic. And that would be fine if Wii Music had some substance to it that made it a worthwhile experience, but it's less like a video game and more like some bizarre social experiment with noise. That's definitely what E3 made it look like. But we're not here to pick apart Wii Music's incredibly flimsy premise and shallow gameplay depth, because the controls are okay, right? I mean, kinda. I was down for the balance board being used for the drums because that felt like someone had put more than 2 seconds of thought into it, but when you're flailing your arms around like a moron pretending to play the timpani, the magic is lost somewhere along the way. I admire the creativity with limited hardware because Wii Music is somehow able to have at least 4 different ways of controlling instruments, but it's not even close to being tactile enough to feel satisfying. I guess it's fun in a kind of chaotic way, but if you're actually trying to replicate the feeling of playing instruments, it's nowhere close. It's too easy to wave your hands around and reduce Wii Music to a farcical tech demo, and if the intention was to demonstrate the strengths of the Wii's motion controls, this is not the way to do it. It's no coincidence that Wii Sports got a sequel, but this stayed a solo game. At least we got to see a Madonna song on a Nintendo console. This feels very cursed. Video games that come out close to the transitional period between 2 consoles are always a little strange. We'll see what kind of games we get when Sony and Microsoft release their new consoles later this year. But Nintendo had a fun time with the Wii, because they clearly had a lot to work with, and a lot of games that don't necessarily need motion controls, but, you know, don't let that stop you. There's a very fine line between games that were made for two consoles and games that were forced onto the newer, trendier console. Like, Twilight Princess is a great game regardless if you play it on the GameCube or the Wii because it was given sufficient development to function well on either console. The same cannot be said for Mario Party 8 though, which despite obviously being the 8th game in a well-established Mario spin-off franchise, which at this point can probably be made on autopilot, this was thrown under the bus in favour of getting a Mario Party onto the Wii as quickly as possible. These aren't hard games to make, but it seems like the devs weren't willing to experiment with the new hardware for too long, since most of Mario Party 8 is recycled from its days as a GameCube game. Ooh, I love my motion controls bolted on in a hurry. This brings up an extra point, because there's a lot more to Mario Party than its controls, and it's worth mentioning that the 8th game has some great ideas for boards that I really enjoy playing through. The mini-games less so, because when the vast majority of them require you to wrestle with the Wiimote and attempt to make sense of controls that are still somewhat tied to a control stick, I kinda lose sight of what's fun anymore. The DS port of Mario 64 had some control fuckery with a D-pad pretending to be a control stick, but that is small potatoes compared to the absolute madness that is Mario Party 8's motion controls that just don't work properly. I guess there's some fun to be had from getting some friends together to share your pain, but any AI characters are still coded to be using a GameCube controller, and therefore don't make as many mistakes as you do with your janky Wii remote. So, it's definitely a challenging Mario Party game to play, with one of the few skill-dependent activities being disrupted by shoddy motion controls, but there's a tad too much bullshit for it to be genuinely fun. Luckily, Mario Party picked things up after 8 and took on new, innovative ideas in later Wii games. What, are you fucking joking? There was a brief period of time when the big three console manufacturers were all at least a little bit obsessed with motion controls. Nintendo had the Wii that was fairly basic until Wii Motion Plus helped to make games that resembled their concepts more closely, Microsoft had He Who Shall Not Be Named, and Sony had the PlayStation Move, which is definitely not the Wii, or a special tool for vegetarians who need a meat substitute, but Sony also had the Sixaxis controller, which tracked rotation and translation on each of the three axes as a means of motion control. A few games use the Sixaxis for satisfying motion control like Flower and parts of Heavy Rain, but others like Lair are an absolute train wreck. I mean, wouldn't you want to fly on the back of your own dragon and control it with nothing but your own motions? That can't possibly be a bad thing. The story behind Lair is really fascinating, and I implore you to set aside some time and read Polygon's article about it, but Lair was midway through a tricky development when Sony showed the public the Sixaxis, and inevitably, Sony wanted Factor 5, the devs behind Lair, to make use of the motion controls as kind of a virtual reins for the dragon flying. The controls are never quite precise enough to work as intended, and specific moves in-game will map to specific movements in real life, rather than just using some more forgiving tilt controls for everything. You need to bring up the controller sharply to do one thing, but then it recognizes it as another thing, and it's just ungodly frustrating. There was a lot of pressure from Sony for Lair to be the showcase title for the Sixaxis motion controls, but not only were the devs unable to make it work properly, they weren't all that keen from the outset. Would you, if you've been told that all this development needs to be kind of retweaked to include motion controls? There's few worse positions to be in than a game that wasn't designed to have motion controls ultimately being coerced into having them anyway. No amount of cool dragons can fix that. Oh boy, was the Wii full of some shit. I suppose that's only natural when you stumble across a console that becomes as absurdly popular with a more casual, family-focused crowd as the Wii, since if you can climb aboard and offer something, anything, flavoured with motion controls, you might just reap some tasty rewards. Slightly surprising to see Nintendo add to this problem with one of their own games though, since you'd imagine that they would have enough people working on something as integral as Wii Play for it to not be an unruly pile of crap. I know I said Wii Music resembles a strange social experiment, but Nintendo were definitely pushing the limits of its fanbase when they included a free Wii remote in with every copy of Wii Play, as if to challenge their loyalty with a shitty non-sports version of Wii Sports. Can't say it didn't work though. For For the most part, Wii Play is relatively inoffensive. It doesn't pretend to be a quintessential part of anyone's library aside from the free Wii remote, and it functions as a quick collection of minigames that show off some of the ways that the Wii remote can be used. Here's the thing though, more so than with Wii Music, Wii Party has close parallels to Wii Sports as a tech demo for motion controls, but one that doesn't come packaged with the console and ask you to spend some of your hard-earned cash for the privilege. Tanks is good, and hilariously deep considering everything else that's on the same disc, but laser hockey is prone to glitches, much like billiards, and fishing is just spectacularly bad. I know what I need to do here, but it feels like it only works half the time, and those are rough odds when you're trying to convince players that the Wii and motion controls on the Wii have a rosy future together. Even more damning, the controls are frustrating enough for Wii Play to fail hard as any kind of go-to party game, because I don't know anyone's grandma who'll be able to wrap their wrinkled head around controls as imprecise as this. Hey granny, do you want to play a disappointing version of table tennis? Chess sounds fun right about now. Unsurprisingly, Wii Play was developed alongside Wii Sports, Music and Fit as a way of demonstrating the little intricacies of the new technology in a physical, tangible game you can take home and play on your new console. In which case, it's a little surprising to me that Fit and Sports got so much love, whereas Music and Play were left to fend for themselves a bit. The fact that Wii Play came with a free Wiimote is kind of the reason behind its massive sales figures, but was this the case all along? You might as well not have made any effort at all. Is it strange that we haven't talked much about the Xbox Kinect yet? A little bit, yeah, because when I think of terrible motion controls, my mind wanders in the direction of Microsoft's insistence that tangible controllers are an unnecessary bump in the road towards true innovation and looking like a knob in your own house. You think the times we live in now are hard? You should have been there when Phil Spencer was telling us this is what the future of video games look like. Yikes. So, as a starter, let's talk about Rise of Nightmares, a survival horror game designed for the Xbox Kinect, which was, at the time, the first M-rated game for the system. Bit of a strange decision, since most of the marketing and press releases surrounding the Kinect steered towards how it can bring your family together under one console that never stops looking at you, and I'm not so sure how a horror game fits in with all that. You know, other than the constant surveillance theme. That'd make for a creepy game. Rise of Nightmares is an unmitigated failure, but not because it's a horror game though. Conceptually, a Kinect horror game is a bit of a curveball because I imagine a lot of the subtle atmospheric qualities are undone by someone jumping up and down in front of a sensor, but Rise of Nightmares has further problems relating to the jumping up and down not doing much to help you stave off all the monsters. It presents an issue that almost works in the game's favour because imprecise controls help you to feel even more vulnerable in the game, removing any guarantee that you can do anything to escape from a dangerous situation, but rather than generate tension or a sense of vulnerability, it's just a ton of frustration. Rise of Nightmares isn't a great game regardless, but the motion control straight up not working half the time doesn't do it any favours whatsoever. I've seen it with other non-Kinect games, and from my own experience, motion controls aren't best suited for horror games. It just seems to ruin the immersion too much. Cross that genre off the list then. Despite the general tone of this video, I live for unconventional control schemes. Maybe that actually underlines my point further, since motion controls tend to flatten out any intricacies of strange alternative controllers and replace them with a series of vague gestures that may or may not be picked up by a sensor that is a good decade off working as intended. Steel Battalion is one of the wildest ideas for controlling a video game and finds better company with a flight simulator than a standard video game, as you're put in charge of a tank with an elaborate spread of controls and buttons to be overwhelmed by. The challenge and the satisfaction comes from mastering these controls and knowing what everything does over the course of many hours of slowly getting to grips with a very complex control scheme. By that measure, it's both surprising and not at all surprising that a Steel Battalion game was made for the Xbox Kinect, since on the one hand, these games are all about those crazy controls, but on the other, they're all about those very tactile controls that might not be adequately replicated by all the motion controls in the world. Not that stopped them from trying. Steel Battalion Heavy Armor is tragic more than anything else. It's like looking at Guitar Hero with its satisfying guitars and wondering if you can get a similar experience from miming the same actions. No, not even close. If you've ever got a comparison as unflattering as that, there's no doubt that you're going to struggle to imitate a unique control scheme with just a handful of hand motions. Steel Battalion Heavy Armor takes the traditional control scheme of other games in the franchise and makes it all virtual, which is at least an interesting experiment in attempting to thicken the layer of immersion, but it's just a sad final product. Considering how engaging the traditional controllers are, a gesture-controlled Kinect system that is often unresponsive and doesn't always recognize your inputs is criminally bad, and the game never recovers from this. In fact, the series hasn't recovered since there haven't been any more Steel Battalion games in the 8 years after Heavy Armor, and the most recent representation of this franchise is this horrible mistake. A mistake made by From Software? What the fuck? From Software making a terrible Steel Battalion game just 1 year after Dark Souls 1 came out. Safe to say, not their best work. The irony of Steel Battalion Heavy Armor is that, in an attempt to make it more of a virtual experience on the Kinect, they have still maintained the expense of buying this game in the first place, because to get the controller for older games, it would cost you, $100 and more, like a Guitar Hero peripheral. But with the Kinect, you still have to buy the actual physical Kinect to play the game, if you haven't already, and, there's not a ton of games you would want to buy it for, and also the Steel Battalion game. And then you buy it, and then you play it, and then you realise you wasted money because it's actually a pile of crap. So, just buy the controller, play older games instead, guys. Watching someone play an FPS game on the Kinect is the funniest goddamn thing in the world. Whereas other actions are a relatively natural fit for the Kinect, no one really worked out the most natural motion for shooting a gun. Maybe because of this, the only FPS game on the Kinect that gained any significant traction is Blackwater, a rather unfortunate game about assuming the role of a Blackwater contractor who in real life are part of a private military who roam the globe for conflict and only sometimes fire on unarmed civilians and children. So, great start, and that's before we even get to the motion controls that look really exciting in this trailer, where you're ducking behind invisible cover and leaping behind your sofa to avoid grenades. Yeah, I'm sure the Kinect knows how to do all of that. Once you move past the novelty of playing a shooter game with your body, Blackwater is an uncontrollable mess. Unlike the pointer controls on the Wii Remote that actually work perfectly with the best shooters out there and end up being the optimal way of playing games like Resident Evil 4, aiming with your real-life hand isn't as successful as you might hope, and it is so frustrating not being able to hit these enemies, who are standing completely still by the way, in a game that is just a light gun arcade game but with an expensive webcam bolted near your TV and no gun. It is agonizing to play, and even worse to experience as a hero story for an egotistical PMC that is trying to glorify war zones. Thankfully, it's not burdened by realism. Motion-controlled racing games are a slippery slope. You might think that'd be a natural pairing, since you wouldn't need many motions to get a vehicle around a racing track. Is what, left, right, maybe forward and backwards too if you're feeling fancy? That's not too difficult, right? Unfortunately, racing games live and die by their controls, and you will always feel the difference between a car that controls well and does what you want, and one that just kinda doesn't. Mario Kart is a mixed bag because the Wii game offered motion controls as an option instead of a mandatory shackle weighted to your ankle that you have to drag it everywhere you go. Later games showed that an analog stick was capable of giving you greater precision while also offering tilt controls as means of smack-talking online opponents. What I wouldn't give for Sonic Free Riders to have an analog stick. That game exists, and it's called Sonic Riders or Sonic Riders Zero Gravity, which are both fun games to play because you can push the control stick in a direction and you'll actually go in that direction. Fuck me, this could catch on. Adding free to the Sonic Riders title is a shrewd addition because it goes some way towards explaining the main inspiration behind leaving the controlling of this game up to the sack of meat trying to get the Kinect to listen to them, because this definitely doesn't feel like anything I'd want to pay for. Often feels like Sonic Team should be sending me money for playtesting a pre-alpha version of their crappy racing game, because the controls are so broken that it's a tricky task to get to the end of a race without coming to the all-too inevitable conclusion that life is too short to spend any more of it trying in vain to steer Sonic around the corner by contorting your body in a series of elaborate yoga poses. Sonic's been in some shockingly bad video games before, but few have been as hard to get a handle on as Sonic Freeriders, and with this being the last Sonic Riders game for the last 10 years, and with motion controls all but phased out, we may never see a Sonic game with controls this bad again. Don't take that as a challenge, Sega. You know, this video would have been unsatisfying and very incomplete if I didn't take some time to talk about some crappy Wii shovelware. That term might be a tad inaccurate because shovelware by its nature is heaped onto any console within shoveling distance without any substantial changes made in order to maximise profits on a low budget game. This can't really happen with the Wii because motion controls do require a bit of extra effort to bring them into existence, but that doesn't mean that you can't still have a ton of very low budget Wii games that try to capitalise on the Wii's more casual audience. If you're rooting around among the bargain bins in your local game store circa 2007 or so, you will have found Game Party staring back at you as just the perfect video game. You mean to tell me that it's both a game and a party? Holy shit, where do I sign up? There are a lot of minigame collections on the Wii because everyone loves a minigame collection and that's clearly where the big money is, but few are as bare bones and as unresponsive as Game Party. This is the yardstick through which you measure every other party game on the Wii and every other Wii game with crappy motion controls, because when you start making comparisons, all of a sudden, laser hockey from Wii Play isn't so bad when you're playing just the worst version of table hockey I've ever seen. It's like the barest amount of content with motion controls lazily lumped in to help with that mass appeal, while attempting to be somewhat like other more competent minigame compilations like WarioWare Smooth Moves. Nothing feels good, everything works only maybe a third of the time, and darts is so bad that I will happily take a real dart to the side of my head instead. Farsight Studios know exactly what they're doing because they would go on to make 4 of these games in total before stepping aside for Game Party Champions on the Wii U. I guess they found their limit, but what else do you expect from the devs who brought Action 52 to the Sega Genesis? That's one twisted looking resume. I know I've been alluding to it all video, but what do you suppose is the single worst genre for motion controls? You'd think anything that requires a lot of very specific input, since even the best motion controlled video games struggle to recognize anything that's happening too quickly for the sensors to register, which is why I'm landing at fighting games for being the most difficult game to build motion controls for. You don't need to have seen a lot of Evo to know how rapid things can get at the highest level, but even when you're just starting out, you need things to be at least a little bit fast so it feels like a real fight. There are some exceptions, because ARMS works really well with motion controls and Wii Boxing isn't half bad, but you could have thousands of exceptions and they'd pale in comparison to Fighter Within. The actual dumpster fire. The legends were true! They don't come much worse than this, folks. Fighter Within, to its credit, is a sign that this technology is still a long way off, but this game is so bad that I doubt we're going to see motion controlling technology develop further for a long time. Its faults are basic and easy to explain, but hard to fix because Fighter Within can just about recognize the most basic of actions and can roughly replicate it with your character on screen, but problems arise very quickly whenever you try to do any combos or any advanced moves because the Kinect is simply not sophisticated enough to understand what the hell you're doing, and so every fight in the game is either a mess of misread inputs or 2 fighters just doing the same basic punching over and over again. Maybe if you take the motion controls away, you'd have something decent here, but then you wouldn't have a bona fide sequel to Fighters Uncaged for the Xbox 360 branch of Kinect. How do these games keep getting sequels? This RabbidLuigi and games like Fighter Within are awful examples of their technology trying to be more than it is clearly capable of, but thankfully the game is quite short, so it doesn't ruin your life for too long. But that just makes me wonder, what's the point in making it so short? If you're trying to convince people that motion controls can be used for full-length video games and are worth your time, why would you make it like a misguided tech demo? You don't want the novelty to run out just in time because, then it's just a novelty.